Why is that? We'll give it time. It is... You can use your computer to take notes too, right?
Yeah.
Just saying. Oh yeah, I'll
Just keep the line.
Is that better?
Yeah, thank
you. Alright, so today we're going to talk about the basics of argumentation. What is argumentation, why it's relevant that we know what it is, and how it relates to this big, beautiful thing called debate. We're going to talk a little bit about some argumentative models, ways to sort of diagram the component parts of an argument to sort of get you thinking about, is what I just said actually an argument, or is it really just sort of a statement that's unsubstantiated with evidence or information? We're going to talk about various argument types, ways that you can sort of identify particular arguments, and we're also going to talk about fallacies, right? Being able to identify an argument that your opponent has made and being able to say, hey, this is a fallacy because of, and get your judge to disregard it, look at it skeptically, etc. Okay? And it'll take around an hour, maybe a little bit more, and then after that you'll have a short break, and then you'll hear from Peyton about how to prepare for tournaments, right? And for a lot of you, that tournament starts tomorrow, and for the PF kids, that starts on Friday. But given how many times you're likely going to debate over the course of the year, learning some tips about how to prepare for a tournament, i.e. before you even step foot at the tournament and while you're there, will be helpful as well. Okay? Why do we debate? Why do we argue? Right? Here are some of the answers, but they're not all of them, and I'll let you provide answers that aren't up here. Right? The first is to identify and interrogate a controversy. So, public forum kids, what's your topic for camp?
On balance, the benefits of the United States free trade agreements with Latin America outweigh all.
All right, so basically, is free trade with Latin America good or bad, right? And presumably that's a controversy, right? Because if it was one-sided, if everybody agreed that trade with Latin America is good, like we all think that the sky is blue, is there really a debate that takes place? No, right? There has to be some controversy, right? And you presumably debating that controversy in order to provide some insight, some answers, right, as to whether or not on the whole or on balance, as the resolutional wording suggests, whether it's good or bad for Latin America, right? Policy kids, what's our topic? Right, you don't have to restate the res, but just like basically, what's our topic? All right, so is economic engagement with 3 Latin American countries good or bad? Right? Okay. But it could be good, right? That's why we have debates, right? There's a controversy about whether or not we should be economically engaging these particular countries, and we debate that controversy out. On the affirmative, we defend one side of the controversy, and on the negative, we defend another. But a purpose of debate and a purpose of arguing in the formal setting that is policy or public forum is to identify and interrogate particular controversies. Last year, right, for the policy kids, it was transportation infrastructure, right? PF kids, it was that, but also other topics over the course of the year, right? We don't debate things like the sky is blue because they aren't controversies, right? We don't debate that we need oxygen to survive. It's not a controversy, right? We debate controversies because we hope to resolve them, right? 2, we debate in order to articulate and overcome differences, right? So when someone says something and Deontay's like, no way, right? He debates in order to articulate, right, his difference of opinion, right? He wants to state that, like, this is not right, this is incorrect, this relies on faulty reasoning, etc. Just like if Tate stands up, right, and she's just like, look, I know you've read this particular argument, but there's no reason why we couldn't do both, right? We can both embrace economic engagement and acknowledge the flaws of security discourse, or whatever it might be, right? We engage in debate to both articulate, right, differences, we are the neg, we disagree, right, or to overcome differences. Maybe an example being a permutation that sort of articulates reasons why both sides are good and why it would be beneficial to move forward. Exposure to differing viewpoints, right? One benefit of debate is that it sort of reveals, the other side of issues to you, right? Maybe you have a preconceived notion of economic engagement. Maybe you're just like, you know what? I'm from Sequoia, and it's just true that economic engagement with Cuba is an unfettered good. Okay. Strange, but sure, whatevs. That could be possible. Well, what happens when you engage in a debate? Is that view challenged? Obviously, of course, right? And could there be benefits to seeing an opposing viewpoint to what you previously believed was the unfettered good of economic engagement with Cuba? Absolutely, right? Maybe, you're just like, hey, it is just totally true that, the use of military force in the Middle East is bad, right? And that's your sort of preconceived notion. Well, through the process of debate, you're exposed to different viewpoints, and maybe you're illuminated to the fact that there might be some contingencies, maybe humanitarian-based, maybe just like strategic foreign policy-based, or strange stuff-based, that might justify, right, particular defenses of military engagement in the Middle East. And so one thing that debate helps is that it overcomes insularity, right? It encourages a form of tolerance by exposing you to different viewpoints, by allowing you to see that the world is not just black or white, but various shades of gray, right? Weird book notwithstanding, right? That you can see the world in its complexities, and you can acknowledge that, yeah, you have a certain belief, but that belief is not, 100% true, or it's not 100% right, but rather it was formulated by an evaluation of different perspectives, rather not sort of taken as belief or preconceived and not really changed by opposing viewpoints, right? One is to defend our viewpoints, right? So when you're on the AF, right, your goal is to do what?
Go for it.
Okay, defend the affirmative, right? Defend the plan. Prove the plan's a good idea, right? And right, on the affirmative, you have to defend those viewpoints, right? You have to defend that, the plan's not being done. You have to defend that there's a harm that results from not doing the plan. And there's a benefit to doing the plan because it solves that particular harm, right? And on the negative, you have to do what? You have to defend your counterplan. You have to defend your interpretation of the topic. You have to defend, right, the status quo as being preferable to the world of change that's advocated by the affirmative. And in PF, you do the same point, right? On the affirmative, you defend a particular viewpoint, right? Whether that be the affirmative side, a particular, form of the affirmative, same thing on the negative, right? The goal is to defend your viewpoints, right? And the people that generally win debates are the ones that are able to best defend their viewpoints, right? Likely, another reason why we debate is that we aim to refute viewpoints, right? The F says, shape of the cube is good. The neg says, no, it's not, right? And there's sort of a back and forth, right, that takes place, right? And that refutation, and that process of refutation, albeit messy, allows us to, at the end of the debate, have a better idea of who won that debate, right? We have a broader scope of knowledge because we've been able to evaluate both sides of the controversy, right? We've been able to see the various forms of arguments and evidence that both sides have used, right? And so that you can maybe come to an informed opinion. But that process of refutation, they say, I say, they say, I say, and the clash of ideas that takes place through that process, right, is important in a unique aspect of debate, and that's why we argue, and that's why we engage in this activity. Lastly, right, why do you debate?
To win, duh.
All right, so there's a competitive element, right? For some people that used to be or are currently jocks, right? You like sports, and why do you do sports? To win, right? There's a competitive element to it. You want to hit someone with, your shoulder pads. You want to hit a baseball out of the park. You want to run faster than anybody else, or whatever it might be, right? You want to win. You want to achieve some sense of victory, and the same thing applies for a lot of people in debate. Right, there's an argument that's taking place. There's one side and another, and you want to be on the winning side. You want to win that your affirmative is a good idea. You want to win that the counterplan is better than the affirmative. You want to win that the status quo is preferable to the plan, whatever it might be. And so there are competitive elements as to why we argue and why we debate. Okay? What are some other things? What are some other reasons why maybe you debate or why you think we argue? Deontay.
So I can get a feel of my career pathway that I want.
Right, so maybe you view it as sort of a way to sort of a laboratory, a training of sorts for what you want to do later. So maybe you want to be a lawyer, right, where you get to argue for money.
Yeah.
Okay, and maybe debate in high school is a way that you can train yourself, right, in the various elements that we've talked about. Yeah, sure, that sounds like a great reason why we argue and debate. Right, but what about those who don't want to be a lawyer, who engage in debate? Why do you do debate?
To be cool. Or just an outlook on something.
Okay, it's something different.
Let's go on transcripts.
Okay, so there's sort of like the pragmatic benefits that maybe we talked a little bit about when the admissions people were here, right? It's like it's an extracurricular activity, right? It shows that you've are engaged in different kind of things, right? But why debate? Why would debate stand out as like awesome as an extracurricular as opposed to like art or knitting?
A huge point of debate is like intellectual expansion.
Right, it's an intellectual activity, right? And for things like transcripts and people who are evaluating, your intellectual credentials, whether it be into, get into high school or college or a job, right? The fact that you've done something that's intensive and intellectual and rigorous, right, kind of stands out. And debate is certainly an example of that, vis-a-vis knitting, for example, which might be rigorous but not necessarily intellectual. Okay? Right, so those are some of the reasons why, right? In the policy kits, we talked about some of the sub-benefits of debate, right? It helps us with information processing, right? We can evaluate the L aspects of the controversy and be able to process that information, right? It helps us with decision-making, right? After evaluating both the pros and cons of an issue, we are better able to make the right course of action, and there might be some real-world benefits to doing that as well. Argument versus argument, right? All arguments are not created equal, okay? Just because you say something does not make it an argument, and just because you say something that's the opposite of something does not make it an argument, right? And while arguing is omnipresent, Deontay can attest to that, right? Making arguments isn't, right? Arguing and making arguments are different, right? Arguing is just basically yelling and saying to every right? That's not the same as making an argument, right, which we're going to talk about today and which is the basis of this lecture, right? For example, arguing with your parents about curfew is different from arguing whether the federal government should do X or whether Y should be abolished, right? That's not to say that you can't make arguments with your parents. You can be like, hey, my older sister had this curfew. Why is mine different? I think that's unfair because of X, Y, and Z. Now that would be making arguments. But if it's just like, Mom, you stink, right? Dad, you like gym more than me, right? Or I hate this place. I'm going to run away, right? That's not making an argument. That's just arguing, right? That's sort of an emotional reaction, which you've probably heard or seen before. That's not making arguments, right? That's not what, right, debate as we conceive it to be about. But rather, right, if you're making the case for engagement with Cuba, right, you have to put together a series of arguments, well thought out, based on evidence arguments, right? Maybe it's good for the environment because it ensures that Cuba has access to U.S. technology so that it avoids dirtying up the environment while it drills for oil. Or right, maybe it's because engaging Cuba signals to Latin America that we're willing to change our previously withheld stances towards former enemies, and that's maybe a way to increase our relations with Latin America, and that's generally good for the hemisphere, right? Or maybe it's why it should be abolished. Maybe it's, we should get rid of the death penalty because it's unfairly implemented, and given the stakes involved, i.e. someone's life, we should not pursue a policy that has unfair implications on various aspects of the community. Right, regardless of how we argue or how we debate, right, we should always strive for civil, rational forms of argumentation, right? You should not get into name-calling. You should not be, arguing with someone just for the point of arguing, but rather it should be done civilly, rationally, right, and hopefully grounded in notions of valid argumentation that we're going to talk about later, right? That's what debate should be about, right? Does it always result in that? Does it always look like that? Obviously not, right? But that's what we should strive to. It's hard at times, right, because we're competitive, there are emotions involved, maybe we just generally think that the other team is wrong and we can't stand the fact that they think that they're right, right? But you should strive for rational, civil forms of argumentation, right? Pragmatically, because usually the people that are rational and civil, right, get better speaker points, and that's obviously a goal that a lot of you have, right? But there's also, the sort of human elements, which is, do you really want to invest all that energy in your life, right, kind of going ham on people, right, just being angry for no reason, right? Or do you want to sort of channel that energy in productive ways by being disagreeable but using civil and rational ways to do so? All right, argument or not? On the board I have put two statements, simply put, that's relevant to both of your topics in some way, shape, or fashion. Okay? Economic decline resulted in war. World War II resulted from the Great Depression. Which of these, if either, is an argument? 2. Why is number 2 an argument? Okay, that's historical information, correct? But what argument is that making? Is that really an argument, though?
Yes, it can be perceived as an argument because World War II results from Great Depression. Somebody will be like, oh, no. People are going to be like, okay, that's not true, or whatever.
All right, but do we really have debates? I mean, there could be debates about whether or not World War II results from the Great Depression. But as we sort of play it out in debates, is that an argument as we normally sort of take it as such? Okay. Okay, so it's more, it smells like an argument more than the first one does, right? Why is the first one not an argument? Yeah, Bree.
I don't think either one of them are.
Okay, why is that?
Because they don't have evidence to back them up.
Okay, so the first one is just a claim, right?
Both of them are claims, they're not arguments.
Okay, and World War II results from the Great Depression seems like a claim as well in your opinion, right?
Yeah, there's no evidence to back them up.
Right, and what do you mean by evidence?
Like a card or an author or an article.
Right, let's just say we're like space aliens, right? We can only communicate. We don't know what this card thing is or evidence cards are in debate, right? How do we know? Deontay, you can put your hand down, right? Why do we know that that's not evidence? Why is that not evidence?
I think this is the next
Are there numbers?
Yeah, it's the numbers.
Right, so there's no stats, right? Normally we use things like stats that maybe indicate the presence of evidence, right? We have another hand up over here.
Oh, well, we're saying the second one's an argument, right?
I don't know.
The second one's an argument because not everyone shares that same viewpoint. Like, a lot of people would say World War II started from a lot
Right,
of
but
different
does everybody share the first viewpoint?
I don't think so either. I mean, I don't
But
think
that
so.
seems to be why the second one's an evidence in your opinion, right? Or an argument, right? Yeah.
Actually, I would switch. I think the first one, the economic decline results from war, is actually an argument.
Why is that an argument?
The reason why is because, like in previous debates that I've used, that was the argument that we used against each other.
Right, but is there anything to substantiate that claim? How do we know that economic decline results in war? Because you say so?
Because Royal Ten says
Okay, because what is
A
that?
card. It's
Right,
like-
Sam, I'm a space alien. What is this Royal 10?
It's information that
All
backs
these
that up.
evidence making a claim.
All right, so it's a piece of evidence, but what's in that piece of evidence?
it says that it uses statistical.
All right, so warrants, there's stats, right, historical examples, all that other stuff, right? And is World War II results from the Great Depression? Does that look like Royal 10? Right, some people say yes, some people say no. Right, but there's a debate, right? There's some uncertainty about what it is, right? Most people think the first one's not, but some people think it's an argument. Some people think that the second one is an argument, some people don't. Right? In my opinion, right, neither is an argument. This is my opinion, I could be wrong.
No, no.
Thanks. Okay, neither is an argument. Right? The first is merely a claim. Right? A claim by itself is not an argument. It is a component part of an argument, but it is not an argument. Right? Economic decline results in war, it's just a statement. In this case, it's like a statement of fact. But are there any facts that substantiate that? No, it's just an assumption. Right? World War II followed by the Great Depression, in my opinion, is just data and evidence. Right? It's an historical example, right? But is there anything to substantiate that? Not necessarily, right? In and of itself, if it just stood up, right? If we just looked at a calendar, right? And there was like, what happened in 1929? Right, the Great Depression, right? And what happened in, the 1930s? Hitler went ham, right? And then 1940s, right? We'll say Hitler came to power, right? In 1941, right, is World War II. Now, if you just looked at that on the board, what is that?
A hot minute.
A timeline, and timeline is just like data, right? That's just info, right? In and of itself, that doesn't make an argument, correct? Right? And so while up here it maybe looks like it is, that is basically what this would be in a classroom, right? This is just info, noise, basically, right? And the first part is just a claim, an assumption that's unsubstantiated. Well, what happens if you bring them together? You synthesize them, right? The second part becomes a warrant, right? That allows you to jump to support the larger claim that economic decline results in war. In my opinion, that's an argument, right? Economic decline results in war. Why? Because World War II followed the Great Depression. Therefore, blah, 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 blah. Now, it's not the greatest argument. It's incomplete. In a world in which we had like Royal 10 or some actual tangible evidence, it would work. But if we have this data, right, which suggests, right, something, right, this is data. We have a claim economic decline results in war, and we put them together, and then we sort of highlight a line of reasoning that connects the two, right? This, in most of our minds, is objective truth, right? Did the Great Depression happen in 1929?
No.
Yes. Right? Did Hitler come to power in the 30s and do some pretty bad stuff in Europe? Yes. Did World War II start in 1941? Yes. All those are unrefutable facts, right? That's true, right? Right? And when we see these refutable facts as truth, right? And we can sort of identify them as maybe justifications for a larger claim. In this case, economic decline results in war. We can sort of synthesize those and we start the process of putting together all of the component parts of a complete argument. Down to
Question, like when I'm debating or whatever, they try to throw that fact in that econ decline results in war, and I use evidence to sustain it. Like I'll be like, Germany, had war after their economy crashed, which was after they recovered. So technically, it's not true. So is that vague?
no, you're correct. You can't answer arguments like these, but right, how would you answer arguments? You would use economic decline doesn't cause war. How do we know that? Because Germany's economy recovered, yet they still engaged in war afterwards. Right? That would still be a complete argument, right? It would be in response to this specific one, but it still has the component parts. You have a claim. Economic decline doesn't cause war. What's the evidence for that claim? Germany had a period of economic decline and then went to conflict. Right? But regardless, both are examples of a complete argument. There's a claim, and there's evidence, and there's a line of reasoning that sort of connects those two. That what we see, right, is a legitimate form of evidence, right, or a legitimate justification for a larger assumption. In this case, economic decline causes or doesn't cause war. Right? Well, what is an argument? Right? We had some disagreements here about what was an argument or not, and that is just symptomatic of a controversy that has spanned millennia. Right? Ancient Greece, Aristotle, or the Big A, as I like to call him, right, and many others, right, have been fighting over what is an argument forever, and that still continues today, right? Back in the day, Aristotle and his buddies right, started to categorize topoi, topics, right, and evaluate, right, or patho, right, methods and types of arguments. They would sort of listen to how these conversations and arguments took place, right, in the city centers of Athens, and then they would sort of jot it down. You'd be like, well, this guy said this, that sounds like an argument. This guy argued about this, that sounds like an argument. And they would sort of have a record, right, of the various topics and methods of evaluation that they saw people engaging in the city center of Athens, and they sort of wrote that down, right? And so Aristotle took all of that information that he recorded, right, and came up with 3 methods of persuasion. Methods that you've probably heard of before in various English classes or history classes, whatever it might be, right? Ethos is credibility, right? Pathos is emotional appeals, Deontay, your thing, right? And logos, reasoning, right? Logical reasoning, 2 + 2 = 4, right? If X happens before Y, right, there might be some linkage between them, right? And out of all these 3 methods of persuasion, Aristotle felt that logos was the most important of these appeals in terms of evaluating and creating argumentation, right? Right? That logical forms of reasoning was the best way to engage in debate. Ethos is sort of variable, right? You might have credibility in one person's eyes and not another. It's not sort of objectively universal that everybody shares the same credibility, right? Some people think Bill O'Reilly has credibility to speak to certain topics. Other people think that he has negative credibility to speak to certain topics. That could be the same with Rush, or Obama, or Rachel Maddow, or Bailey in the front row, keeping it gangster with the backwards hat, right? People have differing opinions about what constitutes, right, ethos or credibility. So it's not really a solid basis for, right, evaluating most arguments. Pathos, emotional appeals, same thing, right? Some people respond to emotional appeals and they're like, yeah, exactly. And some people see emotional appeals and they're just like, this is insane, right? I don't want anything to do with that, right? That's just like a way to stir up folks, right? Logos sort of divorced from all that, right? What should be logical to one should be logical to everybody else if we all sort of have a universal notion of what is logical and rational. And that's why Aristotle put logos as the most important of the appeals that he documented way back in the day. Well, let's fast forward 2 millennia. A man named Stephen Toulmin, right, a British philosopher of sorts, was like, I'm unsatisfied with what Aristotle and everybody else for the previous 2,000 years has sort of used to conceptualize arguments. I want to come up with something that's a little bit more simple, a little bit easier to understand, right? A sort of script, a checklist, so to speak, in order to identify and evaluate arguments. And Stephen Toulmin did that, right? And he did that in a book, a famous book in my field of academic scholarship, which is called The Uses of Argument, right? And today, his work is known as the Toulmin model. It's a model, an easy, simple diagram that allows you to identify or map out the component parts of an argument. It has a basic 3-part stem, right? 3 component parts. And it has 3 additional parts, which can be used as sort of a larger, more nuanced way to diagram an argument. But the basics of the Toulmin model is a 3-part stem. Claim. Economic decline causes war, right? Data. The dates in the events that we wrote on the board, 1929, Great Depression, 1930s, Hitler came to power, 1941, start of World War II. Data, raw material, info, right? In the warrant, that line of reasoning that connects this raw data to the argumentative claim that's being made, right? The claim is the conclusion of the argument, right? The claim is what you want the judge or your significant other or your parents to understand. Economic decline causes war, yo, right? Latin American relations are good for the hemisphere, yo. Okay? That's the conclusion that you want everybody to be like, oh, okay. Right? But that in and of itself is not an argument, right? You have to have evidence in favor of that conclusion, right? And that evidence and the conclusion have to be linked, right? We as an audience, or debaters, or whoever, have to be able to link, right, all that sort of data, all that noise, right, to find a relationship between all that data and all that noise to the assumption or the conclusion or the claim that's being made, right? That warrant is a line of reasoning that connects the data, that raw material, with the claim that's being made. Example, tax cuts are key to the economy. That's a claim, right? JFK did a tax cut, right? Reagan did a tax cut. Bush did a tax cut, right? That's all data, right? Those are things that we can sort of identify in the real world, right? Look up, Google it, Boom, boom, boom. They all did tax cuts, right? Well, where's the warrant? What connects those two, right? How is all that info together, right? It's not there, right? And so in this case, the warrant is often implied, right? JFK's tax cuts, Reagan tax cuts, Bush's tax cuts, right? Serve as proof, right? That tax cuts are the economy because it just so happened that when Reagan did cut taxes and when Bush cut taxes and when JFK cut taxes, the economy was sort of boosted afterwards, right? And we can point to those historical examples as data, right, to link to the larger claim, right? And as human beings, right, when someone gives us examples, right, we use examples as forms of proof, right, as evidence, right, in support of another claim, right? And so we're able to identify, oh, okay, that happened, that happened, that happened. These all seem to be examples of the larger claim that's being made, right? Therefore, the larger claim is true because of the examples that were provided, right? And so we engage in this line of reasoning, right? And because we can use that reasoning to connect this raw data with a larger claim that's being made, we can identify that an argument is being made. And the Toulmin model allows us to do that, right? Toulmin allows us to identify data, it allows us to identify the claim, and allows us to sometimes identify the warrant, although oftentimes it's implied. But regardless, we can sort of identify things, right? Another example, right, that I want you to sort of think about yourself. Global warming is real and human caused, right? Ice core samples in global climate models prove that global temperatures have increased 2 degrees since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, what's the claim? Does everybody agree with that? Is that the claim that's being made? Is that the conclusion of the argument that's present? Right, that's what you would want your judge or your opponents to recognize, right? The global warming is real and it's human caused, right? Well, where's the data? Okay, and maybe the increase in 2 degrees, right? All that stuff right there, right? We've got ice core samples, we got global climate models, and there's a perceived increase in 2 degrees, right? All things that we can observe, right? Which is usually something we consider data or evidence. What's the warrant, right? What connects that data to the claim that's at the top? Huh?
It's implied.
It's implied, but in what is implied?
That because it's reached 2 degrees since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, it was human caused, but it's real. And
Right, but can we look at ice core samples? Presumably, right? Can we look at global climate models? Presumably, right? Can we observe a 2 degree increase according to the data? Right? And what do we normally assume? That if we see something, it's true, right? People that see Elvis at Burger King, right, in suburban Memphis, think that what?
It's true.
Elvis is still alive, right? But for some people, if we can't see it, it's obviously not real, right? Have we met aliens before? Deontay?
Yes.
All right, but for the most part, right? Has anyone else seen an alien? No, and so do we think it's true that aliens exist? Some people maybe, because they use some like, well, probabilities dictate that there's always a chance of life, but for most people it's like, no, they aren't there, right? But because we can see ice core samples, because we can see global climate models, because we can observe this 2 degree increase, and because seeing is believing, right? Seeing is truth, right? That's the warrant, right? That's the implied connection between that raw data and the claim that's being made. Global warming is real and human caused. Why? Because we can see global climate models. We can see, right, ice core samples. We can see or observe a noticeable increase in temperatures, right? And that's how you would diagram out, right, an argument based on the Toulmin model, which I think is helpful. Toulmin also helps us theorize different types of claims, right? Claims are not universal. There are different types, right? There are claims of fact. The sky is blue. Right? Is that a question of value? Does that implicate your morality in any way, shape, or fashion? No.
Some people can be colorblind, things not blue.
Deontay.
Okay.
The answer is no. Okay? Claim of value. Right? Something is right or wrong. Right? It's wrong to trade with other countries. Right? It is immoral to put someone to death. Is that a claim of fact? No. Maybe a claim of policy, but it seems more explicitly a claim of value. Right? It involves a controversy about differing values. Right? We have claims of policy. On balance, trading with Latin America is good. Right? Economic engagement should take place with Cuba. Right? Those are claims of policy. Right? And we debate these things out differently, right? Now, rarely in debates do we debate claims of fact. Although we do sometimes, right? Global warming is happening or not would be an example of a debate that occurs over competing claims of fact, right? But do we debate claims of value? Right. Lincoln-Douglas is a great example of that, right? Lincoln-Douglas debate oftentimes, right, deals with specific competing claims of value, right? But claims of policy is what a lot of us do, right? That's what most public forum topics are. That's what almost every policy topic is, right? And so we evaluate competing claims of policy. Should or should not the United States engage in economic engagement with Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela, right? Well, as you can see, it seems like these different claims serve as the basis for different formats of debate, right? Is it automatically true that different claims of value are in LD? No, because LD also has policy topics, right? Is it true that that policy debate, as we know, only involves competing claims of policy? No, there are going to be times in a debate where you debate about claims of fact. Will or will not immigration reform pass now? It's not like a competing claim of policy. It's not saying it's good or bad. That's not really a claim of value of saying it's immoral or not, right? But that's a competing claim of fact, right? Based on the facts that we have, will or will not immigration reform pass now? But as you can see, there's a lot of overlap, right? But these different claims, right, are omnipresent in various forms of debate. But there might be something to the fact that depending on the form of debate you choose to debate it in, it might be more conducive to more or less of the various claims that you're debating. Argument types. There are lots of types of arguments. All right, we have disads and counterplans and T, right, from a big picture sort of jargony standpoint in policy debate, right? But we also have sort of more basic, macro, meta argument types that we're going to go over today, right? So in addition to modes of argument or models, right, argumentation scholars like myself and Toulmin and Aristotle, it's pretty good company if I must say, right, have conceptualized types of arguments that can be deployed and evaluated in debates. They can be formal, they can be informal, etc. Right? There are hundreds, right, that people for millennia have identified, discussed, and evaluated, right? But 10 to 15 are the most common, right? Most common in public, right, discussions that you hear on TV or that you hear maybe at like a forum at a school, right? That are the most common in formal debates like the ones that you participate in, right? Or even in the informal arguments that take place between yourself and your parents, your siblings, etc. Right? Just because we can identify an argument type, however, doesn't mean that it's correct. It doesn't mean that it's infallible, right? Argument types have sort of bizarro weird cousins. And those bizarro weird cousins are fallacies, right? These argument types tape into their illegitimate extremes, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. First, argument of cause. A causes B, right? What causes economic decline? Lack of immigration reform. What causes war? Economic decline. What destroys the environment? Oil spills, right? What encourages political reform? Free trade with Latin American countries, right? A causes B, right? Whenever someone's making sort of a causal, chain, right? This results in that. That, right, is an argument of cause. And how often do we identify those types of arguments in debates? All the time, right? That's just like the standard thing. Now, ironically, most of the time it's not actually an argument from cause. Correlation does not equal causation, for example. But in terms of how they're articulated in debates that we ourselves participate in or that I evaluate, we hear lots of this type of argument. This causes that. Not doing the plan results in global chaos and extinction, right? Or doing the plan results in the displacement of Chinese soft power, and that causes war with Taiwan, or whatever it might be, right? Another argument type, argument from sign, right? How do we know that global warming is happening? We see glaciers falling apart. It's a sign that global warming is happening. Because can we actually see the air get hot? Unless you've got like Superman eyes, you can't, right? But we can see symptoms, right? What happens? Why would a glacier just like break off? When does ice like break? Either with like an ice pick or when it melts, like and pieces fall off. Right? And we can notice that, and according to a lot of people, that's a sign that global warming is happening. Right? Or the inconvenient truth, right? Al Gore's movie. Right? There's some data and some stuff, but there's lots of like images, right? Which most people see as signs that global warming is happening. Like polar bears, they fell off a glacier. Oh no! Global warming's happening. Right? Look, we just saw the biggest hurricane ever on Doppler radar. That's a sign that global warming is happening, right? Or we had 75 tornadoes in 3 minutes in Kansas. That's a sign that global warming is happening, or whatever it might be, right? We point to signs or symptoms, right, that of a larger trend, right? Just like if you're sick, right, you notice what? Symptoms, right? You've got a fever. That's a sign of what? Your sickness, right? You've got like hives and like blotches growing all over your skin. What's this a sign of? You got problems, or you need to get that checked out, right? Those are signs of a larger assumption. In this case, right, an argument that's being made. Generalization, right? What does it mean to generalize? To make a broader claim based off of a limited amount of data, right? And so in this case, right, we would say Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, right? Those are specific people that we can identify, right? Presidents that most people consider awesome, right? What do they all have in common? They're from Virginia, right? And that we consider great presidents. And so if we put all of that together, we can make a generalizable statement based off the limited information that we have Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. And that generalizable statement is the best presidents are from Virginia. The ones that are ranked the highest. Sorry, Lincoln. Tough luck. Right? Sorry, Martin Van Buren. Don't make the list. Why? Because you're not in the company of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. Right? You take specific information and you make a larger generalizable claim. Ice core samples, right? Global climate models, and storm tracker data. Right? That's specific info. And from that specific info, you can make a larger generalizable claim. And that larger generalizable claim might be global warming is happening. Right? Well, the flip side of that is argument using example. Right? And that's when you take a generalizable statement, I am a badass, right? And you prove that example using specific information. I wear flat front khakis. I have crazy curly hair. I don't sweat even though it's hot outside. Or whatever it might be, right? You point to specific examples to elucidate that generalizable statement. And so the difference, they're sort of flip sides of the same coin, right? Argument by generalization, right, goes from specific to general. Right? Argument from example uses general, right? And it goes down to specific. Right? And so what distinguishes these types of arguments is where you start the process of reasoning. Right? If you start big and you go narrow and specific, argument from example. Right? If you start specific and then you move to a larger generalizable claim, that's generalization. Flip sides of the same coin, they are related, brother and sister, so to speak, but knowing where those reasonings begin and where they end will allow you to identify and differentiate between the two. Other argument types. A common argument type is known as the parallel case argument. Okay, and what is it? All right, so math geeks, what does it mean to be parallel? I don't remember. It was a long time ago, last time I took a math class. Right, so like there's that and that, right? They're parallel. Right, they're no cross. In fact, they look very similar. Right, they look exactly the same. Right? Well, oftentimes in debates, you'll hear a parallel case argument. Right, and maybe the comparison is Afghanistan is the new Vietnam. Right? Well, when you hear that, they're treating those two situations as parallel, as exactly the same. Not exactly the same, but pretty much exactly the same. That, hey, we can point to all the things that happened in Vietnam, and we can see all the same things happening in Afghanistan. Therefore, Afghanistan is the new Vietnam. Right? We're drawing parallels between the two. Right? And those parallels are pretty exact. Right? We're arguing that they are so similar in nature that they are like parallel lines. Right? Afghanistan, Vietnam. Pretty much the same thing. Right? And you hear that a lot in debates. Right? This person is the next that guy. Right? Maybe you're in sports. LeBron, the next Michael Jordan. No. Right? But when people argue that, right, they're drawing parallels between the two. Right? Greatest player in their leagues, multiple championships, killer instinct, whatever. Right? Receding hairlines, you know. They draw parallels between the two. Now, it doesn't mean that those parallels are correct, but as it's argued, right, you identify that the person who's making that argument is treating them as equal. Similar to, but not the same, is analogy. Okay? When you think parallel case, think two similar things that are seen or treated as equal. When you see analogy, think two different things that are treated as similar. Does that make sense? Parallel case, two things that are similar that are treated as the same. Right? Analogy is two different things treated as similar. Right? And that's the difference between the two. Is parallel case an example of an analogy? Yes. But in terms of how we sort of identify or distinguish between the two, the way you should do it is analogy sees two different things and sees them as similar. Parallel case sees two similar things and treats them as equal. Here's an example of analogy. Right? What happens when people get divorced? What normally happens is that the husband has to pay alimony or pay something to the wife. That's just sort of how family law normally works. Right? In some people, namely Michael Moore, the famous videographer and documentarian, right, makes an argument that says, well, just like if a man decides to leave a marriage, he has to pay his wife some alimony, that if a company leaves a town, that company should pay that town. Right? What happens right now? Let's say you live in LaGrange, Georgia. Okay? Everybody know where LaGrange is?
Yeah.
Right? Southwest Georgia. Right? There's a car plant near LaGrange, Georgia. Okay? I think it's like Honda, maybe Kia, something like that. Right? Well, what happens if they're just like, you know what, screw it, we're going to go to Montana. What does that car company have to do to LaGrange?
Okay.
Well, right now they don't have to. Right now they can just get up and move. Right? Does that seem fair?
No.
Right? For some people, not. For some people, sure, it's free markets. Get used to it. Right? Well, just like it might not be fair, right? Well, let's go back. Why do we think husbands have to pay their wives alimony once they leave a relationship?
Because their devastation that's left, and like if they have
Devastation
children,
that's love?
that's left.
Oh, left, okay.
Like they say if they have children or whatever, your children, that's why God is against the Bible, because children are very,
Okay,
very hurt.
children, that's separate from alimony.
Okay, and then
That's
also,
child support, that's not alimony.
Okay, and then also reason why, because the wife wants some kind of.
All right, you're getting off topic, right? But in general, right, back in the day, right, households, right, there was a provider in that family, and that provider was the man, right? And so when men decided to leave that family, women didn't work, and so they needed some form of payment, some sustenance to survive, right? And that's the sort of basis, right, roughly speaking, of alimony, right? Well, in some little towns, right, who are solely surrounded by a plant, take Flint, Michigan, right, that only basically exists because of Ford plants. Well, what happens when Ford decides to leave Flint, Michigan? Flint turns, right? It's not great. They can't survive. And so Michael Moore and other people make the analogy type argument. And they're like, look, if it's true that we think that men should have to pay some form of payment to their wives when they leave that relationship, then why shouldn't companies pay some form of payment to towns that they leave? Right? Now, at first glance, do we see a marriage in a town's relationship to a company is anywhere similar at all? No, they seem radically different. Right? But using an analogy, right, in an argument in this case, we can maybe see the parallels between the two. Right? Taking two different things and treating them as similar. Right? That the reciprocity standards that are enforced in the sort of marriage alimony context should be applied to the company-town aspect. Now, whether or not you agree with that or whether you think it's a stretch or not is obviously up to you. That's still an example of analogy, taking two different things and arguing that they are similar in some way, shape, or fashion. Next argument type is classification. Right? This often employs deductive syllogistic reasoning, and it basically is sort of a simple way of saying, well, when we think of a great athlete, what comes to mind? Ty.
Michael Vick.
Seriously?
Great.
Back in the day.
Okay, so ignoring reality. Okay, but aside from person, right? What might Michael Vick have that sort of makes us think of a great athlete? Speed, right? Athleticism.
Popularity.
Okay, sure, popularity. Being an idiot, right? Okay, but right, those are all things, right? And we could classify, right, as this is the category of a great athlete, a popular athlete. They got all these things, right? And so when we see someone like LeBron, right, can we compare that to this class of info? Speed, yep. Athleticism, yep. Popularity, pretty much, but certainly before the decision, right? Right, and so we can use these classifications to place people in certain categories, right? And why do we put people or put certain things in categories? Why do we use categories?
To identify or
To identify and sort of make sense of the world, right? The world's a crazy place. There's a lot of noise, a lot of stuff going on, and we make these classifications and these categories in order to make sense of the world. And you can argue according to classification, right? This guy is clearly a liberal. How do you know that? Right? Because we have methods of classification, right? There are categories that we sort of hold to be true, right? Voting record, state where they're from, maybe like their like sort of background or skin color, right? Maybe the amount of money that they make, right? All these things are things that, you know, people sometimes use to classify, right? And they employ deductive syllogistic reasoning in order to make those classifications. And there are argument types that also engage in similar classifications as well. Authority, one of my favorite types of arguments, right? Argument from authority. Why does global warming exist? Because Al Gore said so. Okay. Is Al Gore really an authority on global warming? Some people think so. Why? Because that's pretty much all he's talked about from pretty much all you guys can remember. Okay. But does Al Gore have an advanced degree in climatology? No. Right? Right? Does he have a PhD in meteorology or climatology or paleoclimatology?
It's not a credible source.
No. Right? But for some people, they don't. They think he is credible, and for other people, they don't. Right? And so that appeal to authority that some people use, global warming's happening. Anything inconvenient truth, yo? You know, it's maybe some specious stuff. Right? What about civil rights? So what happened yesterday? What did the Supreme Court do?
They tightened the voting rights.
It did some damage to the Voting Rights Act.
Why did they what now?
Yeah, no, you gotta read Google, Deontay. Google News. Nah, you should pay attention to me first. You can do that over lunch. Right? So they restricted the Voting Rights Act, which is a major component of civil rights legislation that took place in the mid-1960s. Right? And what is a powerful argument to support civil rights? To maybe oppose that Supreme Court decision? Well, maybe goes against what LBJ did. It goes against what JFK was for. Right? It goes against what MLK stood for. Right? And do we see MLK, LBJ, not LeBron James, but Lyndon Baines Johnson, and JFK as like historical, powerful figures that we all respect? Most people do. Right? We see them as figures of authority. Right? People that we carry with, we behold and love. Right? And if people are doing things or believing things that are in violation of what those people stand for, right, you maybe can make the argument, hey, the greats of the world disagreed with you. Right? And if we hold those people with any respect, we hold them in, right, any positions of power. If we respect their authority, then, hey, we should get on board with what they say we should do. So argument from authority happens a lot. Sometimes it's misplaced, right? Sometimes, right, authority is assumed when it's not actually the case, right? But sometimes it isn't, right? When evaluating whether or not immigration reform is good or bad for the economy, right, is a staff writer from the Bismarck Tribune an authoritative source? No. Right? Because how do you even know about the Bismarck Tribune? Exactly. Right? It's not a credible source. That doesn't come to mind of like, it's not the New York Times, it's not even the Boston Globe. Hell, it's not even the AJC. Right? It's the Bismarck Tribune. Bismarck is the capital of what state? North Dakota. All right, folks, let's do some geography when we get home. All right. But no, right? And we don't generally think that Bismarck, North Dakota is the haven of like political insight or policy analysis, right? Instead, right, we maybe see someone who works at the Center for American Progress or the Heritage Foundation or some think tank is being way more authoritative to speak to the effectiveness of immigration reform on the economy than a staff writer in North Dakota. Other ways of identifying or delineating arguments. There's a man. His name is Chaim Perlman. First name is C-H-A-I-M. He's Belgian. He's from Belgium. Okay? And he, a little before Perlman, but around the same time, or not Perlman, but Toulmin, around the same time, also sort of was upset and sort of unsatisfied with how argumentation theory and the field of debate had sort of progressed for 2,000 years. And he was just like, you know what, I'm going to do my own thing. And he did have a muse, but that's not really relevant for this. Right? And Perlman saw that the goal of debates, or the goal of arguments, was adherence. Right? Why do you argue in a debate? Who are you appealing to? Is it to convince your opponents that you're right?
No, to get the judge.
To get the judge, right? To get the judge to adhere to your viewpoint, to adhere to your arguments as why the app is a good idea, right? Or if you're on the negative, to adhere to your arguments about why the status quo is preferable, right? The goal is adherence, right? When Obama gives a speech, global warming, which he did fairly recently, right? The goal is to do what? Just to give a speech? To hear himself talk? To some people, right? But no, for the most part, right? It's to get people to adhere or to share his view about the need to act on global warming. And that's how Perlman sort of saw the big picture justification for argumentation and debate. We engage in arguments, we engage in debates in order to gain adherence, right, with our viewpoints. And he created schemes to classify, identify, and evaluate argumentative strategies in terms of their ability to gain adherence. Right? So according to Perlman, a good argument is one that is likely to gain adherence from your audience. Right? That's his determination. That's his standard of evaluation. Right? And so he sort of made a list, like Aristotle did. And he sort of identified the arguments that typically are more likely to gain adherence, right, with particular audiences. Right? And these schemes have to identify the location, right, of common topics when arguments, or what he calls loci communes, right? It allows us to sort of identify what topics, right, tend to produce more adherence on the part of an audience as they are played out in debates. Right? The first scheme that he sort of identifies is argument by comparison. Right? You can think of this as sort of a metaphor, simply put. Right? But metaphors, analogies, parallel case arguments are all arguments by comparisons. Because what do? They're comparing two things. Afghanistan is Vietnam. That's a comparison. Right? Alimony in a marriage is like payment of a company to a town it leaves. Right? There's a comparison there. Right? Metaphor. Right? Literary device, English 101. This is that, without like or as, because that would be a simile. Okay? Right? All these are arguments by comparisons. Right? And so when you sort of identify that, you can sort of identify these arguments by comparisons. And according to him, that was an argument that was very good at gaining audience adherence. Because as humans, right, we're used to metaphorical reasoning, right? We're taught it at a young age. We can identify those things. We oftentimes see the world in terms of metaphors, etc. Right? There are subtypes of an argument by comparison. One is sacrifice, right? So oftentimes when someone demonstrates that they are willing to or have made a big sacrifice, what do we see of that person? We automatically see them as worthwhile, as deserving of respect, right? And one of the reasons why McCain, right, was a good, although not a great candidate for president was because he made a certain amount of sacrifice. And when he was arguing for the war in Iraq, he made a claim that was like, hey, I'm willing to lose the presidency for what I believe, and that is we should increase more troops in Iraq. And for a lot of people, that was a powerful statement that attracted a lot of people to his candidacy, and that was an argument of sacrifice, that he was willing to sacrifice his political fortunes, right, for what he believed to be true. Right? Middle ground is another argument of comparison. Right? You know, you're either with the terrorists or you're with America. Is that really how the war on terrorism sort of plays out? Is it really that cut and dry? Obviously not, right? And so arguments that are just like, look, it's not really a question of whether you're with us or with the terrorists, right? There's a middle ground approach that seems to find a balance between, right, wanting to enact retribution against those that take American lives, yet not, right, thinking that being an American is absolute good, or that, you know, that it's unfettered good, that we just blow up things with drones. No, there's a middle ground, right? And that ability to sort of portray a middle ground solution is also an argument by comparison, because that middle option seems reasonable when compared to one extreme or the other. Pragmatic argument, a very common argument in debates, right? Right? Anytime someone uses a pragmatic argument, they're basically using sort of basic cost-benefit analysis. We should do this because the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. Right? We should do this because the pluses outweigh the minuses. Whenever someone's arguing according to that logic, that's an example of a pragmatic argument. Why? Because we generally deem actions that are weighing the benefits and disadvantages of something and then undertaken as being pragmatic. Right? What does it mean to be pragmatic? To be rash and emotional and just do things on the fly? No, that there's a well thought out process that's involved in those actions. Right? And a pragmatic argument is the same thing. It's not an argument that's just rash and grounded in emotion, that it's it's not grounded in reality, but rather it's aware of all of the particular circumstances, it's aware of the various contingencies, it's aware of the possible advantages and disadvantages, and then, right, a point is made, or a stance is taken, or an action is taken, and that's, right, a pragmatic argument. And so in policy debate especially, right, we find a lot of pragmatic arguments, right? The 2NR or 2A overview is all about pragmatic arguments, right? Right? Vote affirmative over the negative because our impacts are bigger, right? They're faster, and we solve better than the counterplan does, right? Those are all sort of pragmatic considerations, right? More destruction is bad, thus we want to avoid it, right? Avoiding faster destruction is good, so we avoid it, right? And we generally want to pursue policies that are more solvent than others, right? And all of those are cost-benefit analyses that are symptomatic of pragmatic arguments. Argument by division is another argument scheme that Perlman identified and that, as a sort of common argumentative tactic that people use in debates, right? And it's when you take all of the available policy options and reduce them to two, right? So on the policy topic, an example of this might be this, right? So it's really just a question of engagement and appeasement, right? What's appeasement?
Something that you do to get someone's attention.
Right, but in the process of historically, right? What policy of appeasement, Rachel? What does that describe?
Like letting countries do bad things just so you don't get
Exactly, right? Being nice to someone regardless of the consequence, right? And so one thing that you'll find in the process of research, especially in the area of Cuba, right? You're going to find people that are pro-engagement, right? That engagement in itself is an unfettered good. It is good to be nice and to talk to countries. Right? And then there are going to be some people that say, you know what engagement is? That is appeasement. Right? Right? Cuba is evil. They do bad things. And do you know what talking to evil and talking to someone who does bad things condones? Evil and bad things. In fact, it makes those things more likely to occur. Now, when we evaluate U.S. policy towards Cuba, is it really engagement versus appeasement? No, obviously not, right? There's a spectrum, right, between those two options. But argument by division, right, one that you'll come across in the literature is one that tries to, right, limit the scope of the controversy to merely two options, engagement versus appeasement. You're either with us or against us. You either love the Bulldogs or you hate the Bulldogs. You can't be a Wake Forest fan, right? Or you can't love Georgia and Tech, because that ain't okay. Okay? Hey, right, let's focus. We're almost done, I promise. Right, residue arguments. This is a cool form of argument. Right? It's a type of divisional argument. Right? And the option is this. Right? So let's say you and your friends are talking about going to dinner. Right? And you are just like, all right, here are our options. We've got the shady Chinese place. We've got the Indian place that has way too spicy food. We've got the taco place whose health rating is in single digits. Or we've got McDonald's. Right? What? Obviously, where are you going to go? Most people are going to go McDonald's. But why would you go to McDonald's? Is it really because McDonald's is a great option?
No.
It's because the other three are terrible. Right? You don't want to mess with that. Right? But is that really a reason why McDonald's is a great option to go to dinner?
No.
No. In fact, McDonald's is flawed for a number of reasons. Right? But compared to the other options, it seemed great, right? And that's what's known as a residue argument. It's where you lay out sort of your options in a strategic way so that one option stands as obviously better than the other, right? Hey, we could go to war with North Korea. We could blow up Cuba. We could invade Mexico. Or we could send some oil to Venezuela. No offense, one of those seems better than the others. Let's send some oil to Venezuela. Right? Does that mean it's a good idea? No. It's just the best of the available options. Right? But does that mean it's a good idea? No. But that type of thing happens all the time. Right? Option A is too costly. Option B takes too long. Option C is really unpopular. Therefore, what's left? Doesn't matter. It just looks better than the other options. But it's not a reason why option D is better or good. It just means that option B is better than the alternatives. And when you see that, that's an example of a residue argument. Other ones that are up here, we'll sort of skip through. You can read it on the overhead when it's posted to the GDI website. Directional arguments: A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. That is the disadvantage 101, right? The plan hurts. The plan is unpopular. That hurts political capital. That hurts immigration reform. That hurts the economy. That hurts everybody, right? That's a directional argument. You take one step, then another step happens, then another step happens, etc. Doesn't mean it's legitimate, as you'll see in a second. Arguments in waste and sacrifice, right? Why should we not get out of Iraq? Because it means that all of the lives that were lost are gone in vain. Okay, sure. Argument from sacrifice. We don't want to waste things because it's generally seen as something that's bad. Therefore, we should continue the course that we're pursuing. Fallacies. Right? What are fallacies? They're the flaws, right? They're these argument types taken to their illogical extreme, right? They're the crazy uncle flip side of the really nice aunt versions of argument types, right? And being able to identify and differentiate between valid forms of argument types and the flawed illogical forms of fallacies is helpful in debates, right? Each argument type taken to the extreme has or becomes fallacious. There are hundreds of fallacies, just like there are hundreds of argument types, right? Fallacious arguments are not valid means of argumentation, but do you oftentimes win debates on fallacies?
Yeah.
Why? Because your opponents do not call them out, right? And your judges don't sort of recognize them as fallacies. And so one thing you've got to do in debates is to be able to point out that certain arguments are fallacious, therefore willing to be disregarded. Here's a list of fallacies, pretty common ones that we're going to go over pretty quickly, some of them that you already know. Hasty generalization, right? Where did George W. Bush go to school? Yale, right? Just like his daddy, okay? Right? And most people think George W. Bush is
His father crazy.
awesome, right?
No, ill.
Right? Clearly not Deontay, showing his political hand, right? But just because Bush went to Yale, can we make any generalizable observations about maybe future presidents that go to Yale? Probably not, right? Because why? That's a small sample size, right? We can't make large generalizable statements from one example, or even two examples.
Now we can make it from Harvard because most of our presidents did go to Harvard, correct?
Nope.
Obama, Clinton, who else went?
Right.
Kennedy,
Okay, so you've picked 3 out of 40, how many?
44.
Is that really enough to make a generalizable statement? No, right? Right. So hasty generalization, right? When someone's making a generalizable claim based off of a limited, narrow scope of info, that's a fallacy, right? Can't do that. False cause, right? World War II resulted from the Great Depression. Do we really think that the Great Depression was the only reason why World War II happened?
No.
Of course not, right? It's Europe. They're not exactly buddies and haven't been for quite some time, right? And that probably is an underlying factor as to why World War II broke out, okay? But when someone says, hey, this causes that, and assumes that there's a single cause for it, that's a fallacy of false cause, right? Or the security cave, for example, right, that we've talked about. What's the root cause of all violence? Security discourse. Really? There's an argument to be made that no, that is not the case. Although Ricardo is just like, obviously it is. Okay? It never loses. Okay? But that would be a fallacy of false cause, right? Anything that sort of assumes that there's a root cause of something oftentimes is fallacious and falls prey to the fallacy of false cause. False dilemma. You're either with us or against us. No, not really. Right? You either love the dogs or you hate the dogs. It's like, no, I like the dogs, but, I kind of like Mississippi State because they're the Bulldogs too. Because I just love Bulldogs. Not everything is black or right. Not all options in the world are, between two of them, right? And whenever someone sort of portrays a complex situation as only having two options, that's a fallacy of false dilemma. False analogy, right? Cutting the budget's like going on a diet. No. Right? Not really. Right? And so when someone sort of stretches the sort of similarities or connections between two different things, right? When they're trying to make an analogy between two different things, and it just so happens they're just too different to actually be analogous in any way, shape, or fashion, that's a fallacy of a false analogy. Right? When a class is really terrible, like, see, how many of you had a class that you just hated? Be honest.
Chemistry.
Everybody has, right? Right? And someone will make an analogy like, oh, it's like torture. Is it really like torture?
Yeah.
No, it's not. Okay? It might be miserable. It might be bad, right? But is chemistry really like waterboarding?
Yes.
According to Deontay, yes. But for most people, no. Right? And so, right, there are false analogies that are drawn all the time. And when you're able to identify them and point them out, fallacy of false analogy. False authority, right? We already talked about this a little bit, right? So, PhD in communication. Does that mean I'm automatically qualified to speak to every issue?
No.
No. So if I'm like, hey, global warming is happening because Hayes Watson, PhD, said so, does that make it true?
No, of course.
Maybe. It depends on where that PhD is from, right? Right? Why is a PhD in communication relevant to climatology? It's not, right? Is a PhD in math relevant to whether or not economic decline causes war? Not really. Right? But that's like different from like math, right? Yeah, Deontay.
Question. Just because, like,
When you raise your hand, I know you're asking questions, so you don't have to say questions.
So, basically, like, let's say if somebody wants to go with, death not purpose source because it's wrong, because not everybody is perfect, so there's mistakes. So, what if, like, there's 5 different ones and yours say something totally different, the other 5 says something together? Wouldn't they go with the other 5?
Why? Where are those 5 from?
Those 5 are from credible sources, but they're saying something totally different versus yours.
Okay, but so sometimes if 5 people say something and 1 person says the opposite, maybe that's a reason why the 5 is true, right? But that's not necessarily the case, right? Maybe the 1 that's different uses way better method of reasoning, right? Has statistics and has evidence, when the other 5 are just like, trust us, this is the way it is, right? And so 5 does not always outweigh 1, right? You could have 5 really good uniqueness cards, but there could be 1 non-uniqueness card that's more recent, that's from a better source, and that uses just like more detailed information. That could mean that it's just overall a better piece of evidence than the 3 people that seem to share the same viewpoint that don't seem to have the merits of that, right? But sometimes like 5 good sources outweigh 1 good sources, right? But that's why we evaluate and compare evidence, right? And that's a process that's inherent in debate, right? But false authority is a thing, right? Some people think Al Gore's an authority to speak to global warming, other people don't, right? And if you don't, you can sort of point to the fact that, yeah, he's a senator that's talked about global warming a lot, but there might be some questions about whether or not he's actually qualified to speak to the particularities of climate science. Compared to most people, he probably is qualified, but compared to climatologists, maybe not. Right? Fallacies of clarity. Right? This is when there's sort of confusion or ambiguity in an argument, but that ambiguity is used as a reason in favor of something, not else. So, for example, have you seen an alien, Rachel? But that's evidence that they don't exist, right? Of course not, right? No, there's a chance, right? You can't rule it out, right? You haven't seen it, but there's a chance, right? And that's all we need to sort of support the claim that there's, right, a risk of aliens existing, right? Or conspiracy theories, right? They take like some semblance of uncertainty, right? And they're like, well, we can't account for the size of the hole in the Pentagon. It just doesn't make sense, right? What they tell us doesn't match up with reality. Therefore, what? It was an inside job, right? Right? There's some larger conspiracy at play. Right? That's a fallacy of clarity. There's some modicum of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is used as evidence, right, for a larger claim. In reality, not so much. We have other fallacies that you're familiar with. Ad hominem, attacking the person, not the argument itself. Ad populum, well, 87% of the public thinks that we should nuke Iran. Does that mean it's a good idea? Obviously not. Right? Because popular opinion in the 1940s and 1950s told us to think a certain way about a certain class of people in America that was obviously not right. Right? Ad populum. Ad baculum. Appealing to a threat or in order to persuade. Right? If you vote against us, I'm going to quit debate. Is that a valid argument?
Yes.
Maybe for Deontay, but for most people, no. It's not. It's not a legitimate reason why your arguments are good. Ad criminum. This is appealing to monetary and financial interests. If you vote for me, I'll buy you some Chipotle afterwards. Is that a reason why your arguments are true or valid? No. You've just incentivized someone to do it, right? Or, and like politicians, they'll be like, hey, if you vote for me, your taxes will never be raised. Okay. Sure, I want more money. Was that really a reason why raising or cutting taxes is good or bad for the country as a whole? No. Right? And so that'd be a fallacy of ad criminum. And ad ignorantium. Lack of knowledge or certainty as proof of something. Have you seen an alien? I haven't. Therefore, they don't exist. Well, we can't say that really, right? But that's how that argument plays out in a lot of situations, right? Those are just a limited number of fallacies, and oftentimes, as you can see, those are the sort of flip side, the argument types taken to the logical extreme, right? And on the whole, right, argumentation is messy. It's complex. There's a lot of factors that go into it, right? But do we have a way to manage this messy, beautiful process known as debate and argumentation? Of course we do, right? We've got argumentative models that allow us to diagram out arguments to identify whether or not they're valid or not, right? We have argument types that allow us to classify and thus evaluate, right, whether arguments are valid or not, right? We have the ability to identify fallacies, to be like, hey, sure, that's a parallel case argument, but that's a slippery slope fallacy because it sort of takes that directional argument to its logical extreme, right? We've got all of these sort of standards of evaluation now that we can use to better evaluate and engage in debates. Right, to win those debates, because maybe that's the reason why we debate. Right, to maybe evaluate our own opinions, to sort of see that there's this opposing side to our viewpoints. Right, to better articulate our visions. Right, because we can say, here are some valid argument types that are in favor of our side of the position. Right, it allows us to sort of develop more information about topics that are all the reasons why we do debate, and all the reasons why we argue. Right, are helped by the ability to identify arguments, evaluate arguments, and to make them ourselves. Hopefully, you're able to do that the next few days and beyond. Cool? That's all I got. Thank you very much. Okay, so take a 5-minute break.